So then if we are talking about planetarization, so we should talk about a possible planetary ethics. Is it possible? And so, how?
I think that we have been, as human beings, asking moral questions, ethical questions about what kinds of relationships we should have to the Earth and the planet, for at the very least, since St. Francis of Assisi. But I think that it's not only desirable, but almost now an urgency that we develop a planetary ethics, an ethics of the planet, that we no longer can afford to simply have ethical systems that are addressed to humans solely. And I think that one of the dimensions of this planetary ethics is an increasing awareness of ecological issues. Mm-hmm. But I also think that this planetary ethics has to be an ethics that addresses cultural diversity. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to talk about biodiversity, we have to talk about cultural diversity. Mm-hmm. I think that this planetary ethics also has to incorporate the insights of ethical proposals such as those of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, which uses what's called the capabilities approach, which I think is a very important ethical insight that up to now, since Kant, even all the way to John Rawls, the focus on ethics and ethics of global hunger and global scarcity has been focused on formal procedures, on coming up with abstract principles that allegedly would guarantee equal access to all. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that the human condition is radically plural. Mm. That the human condition is one such that formal principles cannot cover the wealth of experiences and needs. And that's why I think something like Nussbaum's and Sen's capabilities approach is in line with a tradition that is very important for me, and that is the tradition of liberation ethics, that is attentive to how our moral values have to have some practical truth. That is, they have to have some material consequence on the possibilities of human beings, not simply to survive, but to flourish. So I think that a planetary ethics must be attentive to the different capabilities different humans have in different contexts, and also be attentive to cultural diversity. And cultural diversity is not an impediment, it's not a liability for ethics. Rather, it's a resource. Different ethical systems have evolved different ethical sensibilities. And I think that if there's going to be something like a Welt ethos, to use that Hans Kuhn phrase, an ethics of the planet, of the world, then it has to include the wisdom, the ethical wisdom that different cultures, different societies, different ethical and religious traditions have evolved over millennia. Mm-hmm.
So then, since you mentioned the liberation aspect of it too, that you and Henrique Dussel have worked, where would you say are the libertarian movements, or those who are producing resistance, forms of resistance around the globe that you can mention to us?
I think that, well, I don't have a survey of all of them. I have some ideas of liberation movements in different places. I think that they are everywhere, including in the United States and Europe. I think that there are some movements, the ecological movements that we find in different versions throughout Latin America, the indigenous movements. I think those are very important. I think that the peace movements that take on different dimensions, movements to demilitarize, movements that are trying to legislate against certain kinds of weapons. I think these are extremely important. I think that the different Occupy movements that we have seen are extremely important. The interesting thing about our time is that we don't have one movement. We have many movements. And that's as it should be, because I think we have many fronts to confront. I also think that we shouldn't simply think of liberation movements as movements that are in opposition. I think we need to think of movements that are asking us to think differently about certain issues. So in Barcelona, Los Indignados, for instance, there were a movement of opposition to certain kinds of austerity measures, but I also thought that, like in the Occupy movement in the United States, there were movements inviting us to come up with new ethical ideas, they were inviting us to think of new modes of interaction. And so liberation movements are not simply reactive or oppositional, they're also inviting us to challenge our moral intuitions and to begin to have new ones.
Okay. And so I remember a dialogue once done between the European theologian Pannenberg and Jaci Marasquim, who was also a thinker from Brazil. And it was in the midst of liberation theology, and they were in Europe. And Pannenberg was criticizing Marasquim because the liberation theology in Latin America wanted to be indigenous, but was using European sources like Marx and other people. That seems to be gone away, that critique. But what do you think in terms of creating a local knowledge to use knowledge from other places? And for instance, you've been so much influenced by the Frankfurt School and Marxism and Karl Otto Apel and Habermas. So how would you say, how is it that we create our knowledge?
Well, first of all, if I had been in that debate with Pannenberg, I would say what you claim is European is not European, because Europe also engaged in a process of epistemological colonization. So a lot of the things that Europe thinks are its own, in fact, are a product of epistemic dispossession. And so a lot of the great ideas of the Enlightenment were ideas that evolve in dialogue with the Americas and with the indigenous peoples. The concept, for instance, the Rousseauian and Lockean concept of the noble savage is something that comes from El Inca Garcilaso. And there's one of the things that postcolonialism allows us to do is to decolonize thought by demonstrating how what Europeans think was generated by their own intellectual ingenuity actually evolved through a process of dialogue. Here I would recommend the work of someone like Germán Arciniegas, this great Colombian intellectual historian that has demonstrated that a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers were actually ideas that they develop in a really rich dialogue with criollos and Amerindians and so on. So I would have challenged the assumption that Europe has possession of certain ideas that it alone has created. I think that the Enlightenment itself and the project of modernity is something that belongs to humanity. The Enlightenment is not European alone. It evolved of a conflict, of a dialogue, of a clash with its colonial others, and they contributed to those ideas. So that on the one hand. Right. On the other, I think that part of the postcolonialism is to understand how knowledge is produced. And knowledge is produced in different contexts, for different reasons, in different historicities. And so all knowledge is always local, and all knowledge, insofar as it's local, it has to give a justification of itself. It has to give grounds for its acceptability. And this requires that all knowledge has to always be in a process of dialogue and pollinization and cross-fertilization. So I don't think there is pure knowledge or a knowledge that belongs to one culture. And I think that that's arrogance, presumptuous, and false. Now, with respect to the relationship to, let's say, between liberation theology and indigenous forms of life, or indigenous knowledges and circumstances, I think that that has been going on for a while. We can think here, for instance, of Bartolomé de las Casas, who already back in the 16th century is thinking about different religious practices of Amerindians. I think that we need to be attentive to the different sides that produce knowledge and valorize them and enter into humble dialogue with these different traditions, whether they be indigenous or African or Indian. So, because ultimately all knowledge responds to a very specific human experience of reality, and human experiences of reality are plural, so they're going to generate different knowledges.